Okay, we're live. We can start.
Okay, so thanks everyone for being here. This is the beginning of the June promotional seminars for the School of Materialist Research. If you were present for any of the May lectures, then thanks so much, and we appreciate your continued interest. Today we'll have a talk by Reid Kotlas, and I'll introduce him in a second. First, I would just like to introduce the school itself for those who are unaware of exactly what it is or what we're doing, and then we can continue. So, the School of Materialist Research is an informal graduate and postdoc level program that offers seminars and workshops that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR is an international platform founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture, Theory, and Philosophy of Technics at TU Wien, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, that functions as a global online school combining education, research, and mentorship to advance academic study at the intersection of the social sciences, humanities, and the STEM sciences. So today, Reid Kotlas will give a talk entitled, "Why Was Marx's Materialism Dialectical?" Reid Kotlas is an independent historian of socialism and founding editor of the Socialist Legacy, an anthology of literature from the historical socialist movement. He is also a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Also, for those interested, and I'll post the link in the chat, his publications can be found at reidkane.net. So if everything's okay, Reid, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So what I'll be presenting today is a piece of a larger research project dealing with the meaning of the dialectics for Marx and of his materialist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic, specifically the nature of the dialectic of theory and practice for Marxism, and the relationship between Marx's theoretical contributions, the materialist conception of history, and the critique of political economy, to his practical political engagement with the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat in the 19th century. So without further ado, the question of Marx's materialism raises a whole series of antinomies that appear to divide Marx against himself as implicit or even explicit self-contradictions, and into which contemporary readers fall in appropriating Marx one-sidedly: voluntarism versus determinism, politics versus economics, theory versus practice, consciousness versus social being, revolution versus reform, party versus class. Even the apparently settled question of idealism versus materialism resurfaces, as several currents of interpretation emphasize, positively or negatively, Marx's debt to idealism by way of Hegel, some going so far as to identify Marx as an idealist in some sense, if in spite of himself and his avowal of materialism, while others insist upon the opposition of materialism in an undialectical manner, the opposition of materialism to idealism in an undialectical manner, even discarding the dialectic itself as an unfortunate remnant of Hegel's idealist influence. The ambiguities that encourage such antinomical interpretations are nowhere more condensed than in the famous formulation from Marx's summary of the materialistic basis of his method in the preface to the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. While this raises the question of what such determination entails and what role remains for consciousness, The more important point is that the reversal of the initial clause does not leave the predicate intact. It is not simply existence or being that determines consciousness, but social existence, social being. The social character of existence derives from the basic starting point, the social production of existence. The fact that human beings do not exist in pure abstraction, nor on the basis of naturally given premises alone, but that the fundamental premise of our existence is that we must produce the means of our existence, or rather reproduce those means of existence the society into which we are born furnish continuously throughout our lives. Yet this compels us to enter into relations independent of our will, through which that productive activity is organized, relations that are appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. In another famous phrase, men make their own history, but not as they please, not under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. An historically given stage of development of material forces of production, as mediated by appropriate relations of production, constitutes the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, conditioning the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. Hence, the social character of the existence determining our consciousness, being given and transmitted from the past, and hence independent of our will, still seems abstractly opposed to that consciousness, standing apart from consciousness, determining it from without, reducing it to an inconsequential residuum, a mere effect. As conscious subjects who take ourselves to act according to our own will, we thereby deceive ourselves. We are not free, as our consciousness and will embody forces beyond our control and even our understanding. Our consciousness is false so long as we misunderstand these forces as effects of our free self-determination. Yet this is complicated, perhaps even contradicted by what comes next. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead, sooner or later, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. The crucial question here is the nature of this conflict compelling the inherited relations of production, which constitute the basis of our consciousness and the whole ensemble of our social relations, to change, and the ensuing era of social revolution in which this change unfolds. How these material forces, by virtue of their development, become contradictory, thereby instigating sooner or later the transformation of the mode of production of material life, and hence the general process of social, political, and intellectual life conditioned thereby. Marx was above all motivated to understand this conflict resulting from the contradictions of material life and the consequent transformation that was already underway when he was born, and by virtue of which he and his contemporaries were forced to recognize their time as an era of social revolution, namely the Industrial Revolution. It was in legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms that men, Marx included, became conscious of this conflict, and through which they had to fight it out, that is, confront these contradictions and work through them. In Marx's own case, it was initially in the form of philosophy, specifically the crisis of Hegelian philosophy, and relatedly, the political crisis of Prussian liberalism that culminated with the accession of Friedrich Wilhelm IV to the throne in 1840. The crisis of Hegelianism began with the controversy over David Strauss's book, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, which proposed a demythologized interpretation of the origins of Christianity. Bruno Bauer, a favored student of Hegel before his sudden death in 1831, was charged with a Hegelian defense of the rational content of Christianity against Strauss, but was thereby led to his own atheistic conclusion. Christianity was indeed mythological, but this expressed rather than belied its rational necessity. In Christianity, human self-consciousness reflected and ultimately confronted its self-estrangement, as expressed in a distorted mythological form. What was rational about Christianity for Bauer was that it necessarily led to atheism, to the exposure of its own mythological character and the essence of divinity as human self-consciousness. Bauer became a mentor and friend of Marx, whose doctoral dissertation on the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophy of nature reflected not a commitment to materialism in the sense of metaphysical atomism, but rather a distinctly Bauerian attempt to deepen the Hegelian account of the philosophy of self-consciousness that expressed the disintegration of the ethical life world of ancient Greece and the transition to Christianity, the process by which, as the phenomenology of spirit has it, the slave becomes conscious of his independence as objectified through his labor, his freedom in alienated form, proceeding through stoicism and skepticism to the unhappy consciousness of the divided and contradictory being, the overcoming of which resides in an unattainable beyond. Marx originally envisioned this work as the first installment of a study that would then proceed to Stoicism and skepticism, and appreciated Epicurus not for preserving the materialism of Democritus, which Marx regarded as relatively crude, but for submitting it to a conceptual critique as failing to account for the active principle of subjective freedom. For Marx, this principle was at the heart of the philosophy of self-consciousness. As Franz Mehring put it in his biography of Marx, the aim of this philosophy was to make the individual separated by a terrible cataclysm from everything which heretofore had stayed and fortified him, namely the disintegration of classical Greek society, independent of everything outside himself, to lead him back to his inner life, to seek his real happiness in the peace of the mind, a peace which might remain unshaken whilst the whole world was collapsing around his ears. Bauer, following Hegel, interpreted the rise of Christianity from this foment as expressing the fear of the emaciated ego in the ruins of a vanished world, confronting itself as the only power, but as an estranged, alien power outside itself. The history of Christianity, culminating in the Protestant Reformation, was that of the free individual tarrying with and ultimately overcoming this estrangement, grasping this power as its own in constituting a community on the basis of its free individuality. Bauer took this one step further, recognizing the logical culmination of Christianity in atheism, in which the power of human self-consciousness attributed to divinity no longer needed to be pictorially represented in a mythological figure, but was clearly grasped as its own. In that regard, the young Marx, even before his break with Bauer, was already a materialist in another sense. As Engels later explained, the great basic question of all philosophy, especially of more recent philosophy, is that concerning the relation of thinking and being. This question, he observed, resulted from the complete ignorance of primitive humanity with respect to the structure of their own bodies, who, under the stimulus of dream apparitions, in which conscious experience appeared to be disconnected from and independent of bodily existence, came to believe that their thinking and sensation were not activities of their bodies, but of a distinct soul which inhabits the body and leaves it at death. The first gods were likewise products of ignorance regarding the forces animating the natural world, which were hence personified, understood in the same manner as the thinking souls that animated human bodies. Engels concluded that the question of the relation of thinking to being, the relation of the spirit to nature, the paramount question of the whole of philosophy, has no less than all religion its roots in the narrow-minded and ignorant notions of savagery. The long hibernation of the Christian Middle Ages sharpened this question, allowing it to achieve its full significance, according to Engels, by posing it in the form, did God create the world, or has the world been in existence eternally? This question initially characterized the modern opposition of idealism to materialism. Idealism affirmed divine creation, and hence divinity in some form. In other words, that the natural world was the product of intentional thought that existed outside of and prior to it, whereas materialism regarded nature as primary, and hence as uncreated and eternal. This question had another side, namely, as Engels puts it, in what relation do our thoughts about the world surrounding us stand to this world itself? Is our thinking capable of the cognition of the real world? This is the question of the identity of thinking and being, which the overwhelming majority of philosophers answered in the affirmative. Engels claimed that Hegel in particular took this identity to be self-evident, and that his proof of this identity tacitly contained its conclusion in the premises. This validity would be further proven by mankind immediately translating Hegel's philosophy from theory into practice and transforming the whole world according to Hegelian principles. This was, according to Engels, an illusion, but it was a plausible illusion for Hegel. It was a plausible, not an illusion, a plausible way of thinking for Hegel, who went from an obscure high school principal to being appointed head of the philosophy department in the most prestigious university in Prussia in only a matter of years. Bauer and Marx, facing different circumstances, felt compelled by virtue of their Hegelianism to answer the great basic question of all philosophy, that of the relation of thinking and being, in the specifically modern sharpened form of the question of whether the world was created by God, in the negative. Marx expressed this with a vehemence that Bauer himself warned was incautious in the draft preface for his dissertation, which was not included in the final work, in which he proclaimed Prometheus the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar, affirming his confession that, in simple words, I hate the pack of gods, as philosophy's own aphorism against all heavenly and earthly gods who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the highest divinity, which it will have none other beside, and responding to those poor March hares who rejoice over the apparently worsened civil position of philosophy, as Prometheus replied to the servant of the gods, Hermes, that I would not change my state of evil fortune for your servitude. Better to be the servant of this rock than to be a faithful boy to Father Zeus. Mering observed that Marx, following Bauer in returning to the Greek philosophy of self-consciousness, was thereby picking up the threads of the bourgeois Enlightenment movement, which had revived the doubts of the skeptics, the hatred the Epicureans bore toward religion, and the republican sentiments of the Stoics. Arnold Ruge regarded Bauer and Marx as representing a philosophic Jacobin party, reviving the philosophy of the 18th century, which Hegel himself viewed as only a pseudo-enlightenment and merely a step towards his own position. Hegel, like Kant, had been deeply inspired by the French Revolution, and this inspiration was reflected in their common philosophical project. The French Revolution had in turn been deeply influenced by the philosophical Enlightenment of the 18th century, itself inspired by the English revolutions of the previous century, themselves following upon the centuries of social, intellectual, and political change of the Renaissance and Reformation. The development of modern bourgeois philosophy was hence the consequence and reflection of a whole epoch of social transformation, that of the bourgeois revolutions, which culminated and was consolidated in the political and intellectual revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. For Hegel, the lesson of the radical Jacobin phase of the French Revolution was that raising free individuality into the absolute governing principle of society is purely negative and destructive, self-undermining, and that for this reason, freedom to realize itself positively, it had to reconcile itself to the objective reality of historically developed forms of social life, including the political institution of the state and the spiritual institution of religion. This meant, however, not subordination of individual freedom to the traditional institutions against which it rebelled, but the transformation of these institutions into means of developing the capacities of that freedom. For Hegel, the logical outcome of revolution was the constitutional monarchy, as had resulted from the English Revolution, and which finally emerged from the French Revolution after Napoleon's empire was defeated and replaced first by the restoration of the absolutist Bourbon dynasty, and then, following the July Revolution of 1830, the liberal constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe. Hegel considered his own appointment in Berlin in 1818 at the pleasure of King Friedrich Wilhelm III to be evidence that the Prussian absolutist regime was itself developing in a rational direction, a conviction further supported by the liberal reforms undertaken by Chancellor Karl August von Hardenberg and the king's 1815 promise of a written constitution, which Hardenberg's ministry was drafting when Hegel took his post. Hegel's elements of the philosophy of right, which he wrote at this time, reflected these plans for constitutional reform that he was confident would be realized. Yet they were frustrated in 1819, when the reform era came to an abrupt end under pressure from Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister and architect of the counter-revolutionary Holy Alliance of European powers that defeated Napoleon and sought to undo the effects of the French Revolution, as well as his conservative reactionary allies within the Prussian regime. Nonetheless, Hegel's optimism was bequeathed to his left students, who held out hope for the next king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, due to his gestures in the direction of constitutional reform. These hopes were squashed when he took the throne in 1840, only to deepen the conservative turn of the preceding decades. An expression of this was his appointment of the anti-Hegelian Karl Friedrich Eichhorn as Minister of Education the next year, who undertook to expunge the dragon's seed of Hegelian pantheism from the Prussian university system. Bauer's teaching license was consequently revoked, and Marx's prospects for an academic career ended before they began. Despite growing conservatism in the last decade of Hegel's life, his position of influence bolstered his confidence that, as Engels put it, mankind was still engaged in immediately translating his philosophy from theory into practice and transforming the whole world according to Hegelian principles. Hence, in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, he could assert with confidence that what is rational is real, and what is real is rational, despite the frustration of the constitutional reform movement, whose aspirations were what the book itself attempted to conceive of and present as the rationality of the present state, not the construction of a castle in the air of the state as it ought to be, but how the existing ethical universe is to be known. Engels observed that while this statement earned gratitude from the narrow-minded government of Friedrich Wilhelm III and wrath from its equally narrow-minded liberal opposition as an apparent sanctification of things that be, a philosophical benediction bestowed upon despotism, this neglected that for Hegel, certainly not everything that exists is also real, as the attribute of reality, or the more common contemporary translation of the term is actuality, Wirklichkeit, I believe, in German. The attribute of reality or actuality belongs only to that which at the same time is necessary. Engels explains, according to Hegel, reality is in no way an attribute predicable of any given state of affairs, social or political, in all circumstances and at all times. On the contrary, in 1789, the French monarchy had become so unreal, that is to say, so robbed of all necessity, so irrational, that it had to be destroyed by the Great Revolution, of which Hegel always speaks with the greatest enthusiasm. In this case, therefore, the monarchy was the unreal and the revolution the real. And so, in the course of development, all that was previously real becomes unreal, loses its necessity, its right of existence, its rationality. And in the place of moribund reality comes a new viable reality. Peacefully, if the old has enough intelligence to go to its death without a struggle. Forcibly, if it resists this necessity. Thus, the Hegelian proposition turns into its opposite through Hegelian dialectics itself. All that is real in the sphere of human history becomes irrational in the process of time, is therefore irrational by its very destination, is tainted beforehand with irrationality, and everything which is rational in the minds of men is destined to become real, however much it may contradict existing apparent reality. In accordance with all the rules of the Hegelian method of thought, the proposition of the rationality of everything which is real resolves itself into the other proposition. All that exists deserves to perish. That's the end of the Engels quotation. Hence, for Hegel, the prospect of constitutional reform of the Prussian monarchy, even if temporarily impeded, was more real because more rational than those obstructing it, and the obstruction would sooner or later give way to the necessary change. Hegel hoped that his own philosophical role in society would imbue the representatives of the old with enough intelligence to embrace this necessary change peacefully, and feared the destructive excesses of a forcible revolution. This led him to greet the July Revolution in France and the upheavals it inspired across Europe with apprehension, much to the surprise of his friends and students. He believed political reform could only succeed if it represented a social transformation in which existing institutions were led to understand themselves and came to be understood by the members of society as means of developing and extending individual freedom into a coherent, rational whole, and that such revolutions, in pitting individual freedom abstractly against these institutions, could only undermine themselves. Abstract individual freedom as the principle of political rule would inevitably degenerate into factional conflicts and ultimately collapse, leading to the restoration of that which they opposed. While Hegel retained his admiration for the Great French Revolution until his death, he also thought that repeating this experience was to do it injustice, to fail to learn its lessons, and to develop beyond the limitations it confronted. This would be a failure not merely, nor even primarily on the part of the revolutionaries, but the failure of the dominant institutions against which they rebelled. The former would be condemned to an erroneous course, the revolutionaries would be condemned to an erroneous course by the latter's stubborn refusal to grasp and develop their own rational essence, thereby dooming themselves, as well as their ostensible opponents, to an unnecessary and fruitless conflict. What Bauer and Marx confronted, however, made Hegel's confidence in the reform of existing institutions increasingly unsustainable. The Critique of Religion, which expressed the bourgeois revolutionary desire to advance the reform of the German state through the philosophical clarification of what really exists, that is, what is rational in what exists, had run afoul of the ruling class along with the prospect of reform. The question facing Marx, having finished with his university education, was what task faced a Hegelian philosopher in this situation? How was philosophy to become practical and transform the whole world according to its principles if it could no longer lead the state to recognize its rational purpose by educating its functionaries in the university and advising the chancellor through its influence in his ministry? The answer presented itself through the first work Marx was able to find as a newspaper correspondent, by using the press to educate the people. He was not alone in this, as many of his fellow young Hegelians took to publishing their views in liberal newspapers, pursuing the struggle against the moribund aspects of the old regime by continuing the critique of religion, but also by openly advocating liberal reforms, up to and including a republican constitution. Bauer in particular championed republicanism, but criticized the French republicanism of the 18th century, which had collapsed, for being based on the crude materialism of the Enlightenment, which advocated changing the positive institutions of society without changing the members of society themselves, who remained motivated by their particular, mutually opposed individual interests, which would ultimately dissolve any order established on their basis. He proposed that a republic must be based upon a conscious grasp of the universal interest of humanity in reconciling individual freedom through social order, thereby realizing the infinite creative power of self-consciousness, of individual consciousness that knows itself and realizes itself through cooperation with others, and thereby grasps itself as universal. Bauer, having attained this grasp of self-consciousness, hence tasked himself with educating the people, raising them above their narrow individual interests in competition with one another as the precondition for the political reorganization of society. In that sense, he retained the Hegelian standpoint on the practical realization of theory, albeit in a radicalized form, no longer seeking to transform the old institutions from above, so to speak, this having become impossible, but from below, by mobilizing the people around his revolutionary vision of a rational republic. Bauer retained the idealist presupposition of the identity of thinking and being, and needed the people to make themselves the adequate practical instrument to realize the truth of his theoretical standpoint. Hence, to transform society from below, the people needed theoretical guidance from above. Marx grew distant from Bauer, seeing his critical self-consciousness as concealing a completely uncritical attitude to the method of criticizing. Rather than grasping the negation of the Hegelian standpoint in a properly Hegelian, that is, dialectical manner, seeing in this negation the potential for development beyond its limitations, Bauer clung one-sidedly to it in its negated and diminished form. Whereas Hegel sought to enlighten the existing order as to its rational essence and thereby lead it to reconcile itself with individual freedom, Bauer abstractly opposed both that order and the abstract individuality opposing it, thereby cutting himself off from reality while imagining he had raised himself above it. His radicalization of Hegelian idealism thus had a farcical quality, as the power of his ideas was rendered null by his isolation from both the ruling stratum of society and the masses he regarded with condescension. Bauer's fidelity to the Hegelian dialectic led him to dissolve all dogmatic antitheses into the single dogmatic antithesis of his own cleverness and the stupidity of the world. While Bauer rejected Hegel's philosophical reconfiguration of divine creation, in which the world was conceived as the self-externalization of the absolute idea, he merely replaced the latter with the infinite power of self-consciousness, as embodied in his own critical standpoint, which Marx castigated as that of the critical Christ, before which the whole of decadent humanity would have to assemble in the critical last judgment, assigning each particular mob its proper place in the new order of society. Marx's break with Bauer was facilitated by Feuerbach, whom he regarded as having the only serious critical attitude to the Hegelian dialectic. Whereas Bauer's atheistic critique of Hegelian philosophy merely reinstated a critical religion in which he had appointed himself the high priest, Feuerbach argued that philosophy per se was nothing else but religion rendered into thought, merely another form of the estrangement of the essence of man. To this, Feuerbach opposed a theory taking the social relationship of man to man as its starting point, with abstract thought merely an extension of sensuous human existence. Yet Marx was no more satisfied by Feuerbach than by Bauer, recognizing Feuerbach's poverty compared to Hegel. The Hegelian dialectic in Bauer's hands collapsed into the undialectical antinomy of critical thought and the unthinking mass, provoking Marx to ask the apparently formal but really vital question: how do we now stand as regards the Hegelian dialectic? Yet Feuerbach rejected the Hegelian dialectic altogether, as moved by contradictions internal to philosophy, and hence to the self-estrangement of the human essence, opposing to this the self-supporting positivity of the social relations through which human beings constitute their sensuous existence. He regarded Hegel's religious standpoint, which was negated in philosophy only to be dialectically restored, as mistaken from the outset, and thrust it unceremoniously aside, as Engels puts it. Feuerbach hence confronted the same limitation as Bauer. Unlike Hegel, he couldn't account for the necessity of his own critical standpoint as expressing the rational essence of existing reality. He could only oppose this reality abstractly. Bauer at least had the advantage, following Hegel, of grasping the historical necessity of religion as a process of development that ultimately culminated in the necessity of its transcendence. Yet Bauer's idealist conception of this historical process prevented him from grasping the real basis of this development, and hence what such transcendence actually entailed, and the role of critical reflection therein. Feuerbach grasped the necessity of going beyond the idealist standpoint characteristic of philosophy in general, and Hegelian philosophy in particular. This led him to embrace the materialism of the pre-Kantian Enlightenment, though he recognized its philosophical limitation, opposing the abstraction of thought with an equally abstract conception of nature as opposed to man, rather than grasping humanity as immanent to the sensuous reality of nature. Hence, he agreed with the materialists backwards, but not forwards. He understood materialism as the foundation of the edifice of human essence and knowledge, but not the edifice itself. Sensuous existence was merely the medium of the infinite creative power of humanity, by virtue of our capacity to relate to ourselves through our social relations as members of a species, and thereby, as a species, to freely transform ourselves and our world. Feuerbach conceived of the true dialectic not as a monologue of the solitary thinker with himself, but rather as a dialogue between I and you. Yet he thereby resorted to an idealized conception of man in general, and of the human essence as a merely natural characteristic, species, uniting individual human beings, or real historical men, in an abstract manner. He opposed the self-estrangement of humanity in the abstraction of God with an equally abstract conception of humanity. He could not account for why humanity became estranged from itself, nor why or how it should now overcome that estrangement. He opposed to the theological conception of religion as devotion to a supernatural deity, an anthropological conception which grasped the essence of previous religions as the estranged realization of man's species essence, and hence prescribed a true religion in which human beings would be consciously devoted to the realization of that essence. Feuerbach thus conceived of social relations as generally religious in character, and sought only to overcome theological religion by criticizing the theological conception of human social relations. Hence, his conception of historical change remained idealist, even if he indicated the necessity of reconsidering the materialism that German idealism was supposed to have superseded. This historical idealism itself followed from his abstract and contemplative conception of materialism, which, despite criticizing earlier materialism for failing to account for man himself in sensuous terms, itself failed to account for the sensuous reality in historical terms, as a concrete process of development in which the present was bound up. Marx writes, "As far as Feuerbach is a materialist, he does not deal with history, and as far as he considers history, he is not a materialist. With him, materialism and history diverge completely." He goes on, "He does not see how the sensuous world around him is not a thing given direct from all eternity, remaining ever the same, but the product of industry and of the state of society. And indeed, in the sense that it is an historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, each standing on the shoulders of the preceding one, developing its industry and its intercourse, modifying its social system according to the changed needs. Feuerbach failed to conceive the sensuousness within which human relations are manifest actively, in terms of the practical activity through which human beings relate to each other and to nature, while continuously transforming both in the process. For Marx, the true dialectic would have to follow Hegel, whose dialectic was not a solitary monologue with himself, any more than a dialogue between an abstract I and you, but an attempt to raise his society to the point of critical self-reflection, and to thereby render society conscious of its ongoing transformation. Following Hegel, whose idealism had the advantage over the preceding materialism of developing the active side of the object of thought, albeit abstractly, Marx sought to grasp human self-estrangement as a process of historical development of particular shapes of social life and corresponding forms of thought, in which the self-contradictions immanent in each shape drove it to destruction, out of which a new shape would emerge, superseding that contradiction. Yet Hegel understood this as essentially a process of thought. The shape of social life was fundamentally the shape of its self-consciousness, and the self-contradiction immanent in every form of consciousness resulted from the fact that each was an externalized and hence self-estranged form of the absolute idea, of the absolute freedom of pure thought. This was plausible for Hegel, in whose moment the unfolding bourgeois revolution, the still emerging form of social life based upon the free association of individuals through commerce, premised upon the individual's property in the product of his labor, was struggling to understand itself in its struggle to overcome the lingering impediments of old forms of social life and constitute itself in a consistently and sustainably advancing form. Marx recognized in the materialism of the 17th and 18th centuries not merely opposition to the idealist and theological metaphysics of medieval Christianity, and hence to the Catholic Church, and even religion in general as antiquated institutions, impeding the realization of humanity's natural potential. It moreover expressed the effort to understand the process of industry driving the ongoing social change. The production of the means of material life in the form of commodities, hence the social coordination of production through commercial exchange, the transformation of productive activity on the basis of social cooperation and the division of labor, and ultimately the application of science and technology to the production process in the form of machinery. Hence, this materialism, stemming from Bacon's fundamental principle that all human knowledge and ideas originated from the world of sensation, was developed by Locke in his conception of the common sense of human beings in society as the basis of reason, and further by Locke's French followers, who recognized that the capacities not only of creating and reasoning with ideas, but also of sensuous perception, were shaped by experience and habit, as imparted by education and external circumstances furnished by social life. The moral substance of social life developed from and gave shape to the sensuous material concerns of human beings. This recognition was further developed by political economy, which sought to understand the dynamics of commercial society, how from the intercourse of self-concerned individuals competing to buy and sell commodities, a form of social life transcending their immediate material interests emerged. The idealism of Kant and Hegel sought to further develop this same line of inquiry, which is why Marx described Hegel's standpoint as that of political economy, and why Engels later described the Hegelian system as merely a materialism idealistically turned upside down in method and content. Hegel sought to grasp the self-consciousness of society as the end toward which this revolutionary process was culminating, an end already realized, if imperfectly and incompletely, in the modern constitutional state, in which philosophy had an important role to play. Yet for Marx's generation, this was no longer plausible. The further unfolding of the revolution beyond this limited form was evidently necessary. The state, not only in the antiquated form of Prussian absolutism, but even the constitutional monarchies of France and England, was clearly being rocked by contradictions it was unable to mediate, and that philosophy seemed unable to seriously grasp, either recoiling into an apologia for the existing order despite its basic instability, or turning into an impotent, pedantic exercise of visionaries lacking any real social or political influence. Marx therefore took up Feuerbach's task, not itself original, but a return to the materialist position Hegel had supposedly superseded, of grasping abstract thought as derivative of the secular basis of social relations. Marx, in that sense, sought to reckon with the apparent regression from Hegel's standpoint back to that of the 18th century. He sought to understand the abstract duplication of the world in terms of the self-estrangement of this secular basis, but to go beyond Feuerbach in grasping why this self-estrangement occurred at all, and why the particular forms it took ultimately failed and were transcended in a process of historical development, in order to understand why the particular form that for Hegel appeared adequately mediate and sublate its material basis had failed, and what it would take to transcend it. He concluded that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds, due to the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular basis. That the material life process of society had to be understood in its contradiction. And this meant to criticize its real essence, not only to reflect upon this basis abstractly, but to critically engage with it by revolutionizing it in practice. Marx was driven to materialism out of fidelity to the Hegelian dialectic. As Engels put it, it was the perception of the fundamental contradiction in German idealism that led necessarily back to materialism, but, nota bene, not the simply metaphysical, exclusively mechanical materialism of the 18th century. It was upon this contradiction that Bruno Bauer foundered in his attempt to retain Hegel's idealism, thereby falling into the undialectical opposition of his own enlightened theoretical standpoint to the crude materialist particularism of the mass. Feuerbach's intimation of this contradiction led him to discard the Hegelian dialectic altogether as ineluctably marred by self-estrangement. Yet his recourse to materialism therefore collapsed into an undialectical idealism inferior to Hegel's own. Marx recognized something necessary in the materialist inversion of Hegel, but this meant grasping Hegel's own idealism as an inverted materialism, his dialectic pointing beyond the limits of his own standpoint and the system built upon it. Materialism and idealism were themselves bound up in a historical dialectic. For Hegel, the idealism of Christianity was negated by Enlightenment materialism, with his own absolute idealism negating this negation, making the critical and revolutionary standpoint of modern materialism into the basis of a transformed idealism, submitting idealism itself to an immanent critique, thereby transcending the limits of 17th and 18th century materialism's abstract opposition to ideality. This critical dialectical idealism was therefore the truth of materialism. Yet idealism itself initially emerged in its pre-modern form as the negation of the materialism, so to speak, of natural existence. The hypostatization of thought as a metaphysical reality, independent of and prior to the natural world, while born of savage ignorance, also marks the point at which humanity begins to reckon with itself in its distinction from the rest of nature, in transforming its natural existence by producing its means of life. We begin to regard our own consciousness, as well as the principles underlying natural phenomena, as distinct from natural existence because the ends of socially organized productive activity increasingly structure both our individual activity and the world around us, whose natural character therefore becomes socially mediated, not only in our consciousness of it, but in its very material existence. Yet while consciousness becomes an ever more essential factor in the practical life process of society, this process itself is not subject to conscious direction in its totality. Idealism, even in its critical form, projected such an overarching conscious direction upon the whole, which was plausible so long as some greater order was apparently emerging from otherwise unplanned interactions of individuals and groups. Materialism, on the other hand, denied such an overarching direction, even while at its best suggesting that humanity might be groping towards something like it. Marx's materialist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic is therefore also a dialectical inversion of materialism, or rather, restores Hegel's idealism, itself an inverted materialism, to its proper footing. But this merely exposes the problem. If consciousness cannot be taken for granted as the organizing principle of social life, for Marx, this registered the problem that consciousness could and should become this organizing principle. To do so, consciousness had to confront an obstacle not merely in thought, but in the social relations thought reflected, and in which conscious self-determination, freedom, was a subordinate aspect of an unconscious and unfree totality. Consciousness as such could not confront this problem, but could only do so in person as the consciousness of some part of society, capable by virtue of its role in the practical life process of transforming this process in its totality by raising consciousness to the determining element of that totality. When we read Marx saying that the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, we must recall he also insisted that of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive force is the revolutionary class itself. It is the consciousness of this class in the prosecution of this conflict that is decisive. It will be compelled to confront the relations of production constraining its development, not only as an economic problem, but as a problem of the social totality resting upon and reinforcing these relations, crucially including the ideological, political, and legal superstructure, and hence will be compelled to transform that totality by taking political power into its own hands to realize the otherwise submerged and suppressed conflict in the foundation of social life as an explicit political conflict that society must consciously work through and overcome. And this is the conclusion. This would mean the end of the antagonistic character that marred all previous modes of production, in which humanity confronted the capacity of its own labor as an alien force dominating it, centrally, but not only, in the domination of oppressed laboring classes by ruling classes. Capitalism, as Marx came to recognize, made the transcendence of this self-estrangement possible for the first time in history, and hence made it possible for the prehistory of human society to be brought to a close. As Engels summarized with unrivaled clarity, with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously, the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into really human ones. The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real, conscious lord of nature, because he has now become master of his own social organization. The laws of his own social action, hitherto standing face to face with man as laws of nature, foreign to and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding and so mastered by him. Man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the result of his own free action. The extraneous objective forces that have hitherto governed history pass under the control of man himself. Only from that time will man himself more and more consciously make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the results intended by him. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. And that is my presentation. So, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Reid, for that excellent presentation. We can now open it up. We have about a half an hour or so for a Q&A.
I'm sorry, there's an alarm going off in the other room. I'll be back in 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so in the meantime, if anyone wants to raise their hand, and I can get to you, or you could type it in the chat box, and I can read it, or you can see it. So, yeah. Yep. Katarina.
Let me unmute myself. Thanks, Reid. It was really fascinating. A very systematic overview. I agree with, the synthesis you made between Bauer, Feuerbach, Hegel, Marx himself, in this almost organic manner. The synthesis established as if in this organic manner, at least as far as your procedure is concerned. So it was really brilliant. I loved it. I have a question, and I have a comment before that. Why do you insist that, this is an old argument between the two of us. Why do you insist that this dialectics that Marx pursues is necessarily Hegel's dialectic? Why do you call it Hegelian? I mean, Marx himself calls it dialectics, calls Hegel one of the greatest teachers of dialectics, but treats dialectics as something more generic and a method that he learned from the Greeks, I would say, from, the ancient Greek philosophy. So why this emphasis on Hegel when indeed your reading is very convincing. This is proper dialectics, what the one we see in Marx. You pointed out to the failures of the others brilliantly, but why call it Hegel's dialectics? Only because he was his teacher, or does it have a specific mark that distinguishes it from the other great teachers of dialectics that Marx also mentions? So.
Well, thank you first of all for the kind words. And I figured this, I feel like you're putting your objections a little diplomatically, considering the way we've argued these kinds of points before.
No, it's not diplomatic. Now I understand. Now I understand your points in our arguments better. So that's I nuanced the question. So
sure. Thank you. So, well, let me put it this way. So, as I said at the outset, this is part of a broader project of trying to deal with the dialectic of theory and practice in Marx's work and in Marxism as a political project, and hence the understanding of dialectics within that project, within that theoretical and practical context. And the kind of methodological approach underlying this project of mine comes from Hal Draper, who's probably, in my opinion, he's the greatest scholar of Marx and Marxism of the second half of the 20th century, whose own method he takes from Lenin's approach in The State of Revolution, which, to put it briefly, is an effort to excavate the perspective of Marx himself from beneath layers of interpretation that kind of take up pieces of Marx opportunistically and one-sidedly and oppose them to each other, which already in Lenin's time was a significant problem. That, Lenin saw his intervention in that work as a political intervention, not just a theoretical intervention, in the sense that clarifying what Marx actually thought had important political consequences for the political movement based on his theoretical perspective. Draper's writing in a much more degraded moment, 60, 70 years later, in which, and degradation, regression that's kind of only continued up to the present, I would venture, in which it's so difficult to discern what Marx actually thought beneath these layers of obscurity that even reading Marx himself, what he actually says, because we tend to import so many conceptions from context that was not Marx's context, it's difficult to understand. So I'm trying to clarify for myself and for anyone who's interested in this research what Marx actually thought about these issues. And that's why I posed it in terms of Hegel's dialectic, because as Draper puts it, bringing together everything that Marx and Engels wrote on a particular subject in order to make a coherent sense of their thought in its totality, it's clear to me, and this is only, as I said, a kind of excerpt from a broader set of arguments making this point, it's clear to me that they saw the dialectical approach that they took up as preserving Hegel's approach in a changed context, a context in which Hegel's own standpoint, which they tend to refer to in terms of his system or his idealism, and etc., the standpoint that I put in terms of the role of the philosopher in guiding the rulers of society and the kind of institutions guarding the social order to rationally reform themselves. They saw that approach that Hegel was taking, while valid for Hegel himself, it made sense in Hegel's moment to see that as the role of approaching the social process dialectically. It had become incoherent to continue in that way after what happened in the decade transpiring after Hegel's death. And that, of course, is only the consequences of a process that was already unfolding in the rest of Europe, the Industrial Revolution, but that kind of came late in Prussia and Germany. So it's, reading what Marx and Engels have to say on this matter, not just in their published writings, but in their correspondence and in unpublished manuscripts and so on. They just they're constantly basically upholding the Hegelian legacy against latter-day Hegelians, as well as against anti-Hegelian, vulgar materialists and so on. And they're not doing so in like an uncritical way. They obviously see something essential as being different in their approach from Hegel's approach, but it wasn't that Hegel was wrong. It's that Hegel's approach, as it manifested in Hegel's own moment, while adequate for Hegel's moment, was no longer adequate subsequently because of historical changes that had transpired. And so what they were trying to make sense of is what changed historically. And that's what led them precisely to this materialistic reflection. In other words, the idealistic perspective of Hegel, while plausible in his moment, was itself invalidated by the movement of history that from within Hegel's system he could not account for. So I don't know if that's satisfying. I mean, that's my, in short, I think this is what Marx thought, and I'm trying to make that argument by reference to his own words. And right or wrong, that's how Marx understood his own work. You could certainly say Marx misunderstood himself, and I tried to allude at the beginning, there are interpretations that make that case. I see them as sort of falling into these antinomies, and I'm trying to avoid that, but you know, that's my approach. So.
Okay, are there any other questions? Because I had another one about the thesis, about Marx's doctoral thesis. Why do you think it deals with the questions that preoccupied Bauer, and why do you think that it's not what it seems to be evident, this thesis to be, and that is a certain philosophy of nature and an attempt to establish by way of a certain exegesis of the atomists, heuristic reading of certain ancient texts to kind of establish a proper materialist episteme and model of interpretation of the reality, which is grounded in an interpretation of nature, of physis, as physis and matter and reality were equated in antiquity. To me, this seems to be the preoccupation of the thesis. This is what it deals with, even in terms of, quantity, how much, attention, text, etc. is dedicated to these questions. There's practically nothing on, next to nothing on subjectivization. So why would it be influenced or indirectly dealing with Bauer? I mean, we are aware that Bauer and Marx were close at that time, and that there is talk that Bauer suggested the topic for Marx's thesis, but that does not necessarily have to mean that Marx shared Bauer's preoccupations.
Well, I think, well, for one thing, I quoted from the preface, which was not included in the final work, although it was, it wasn't included not because I think Marx didn't agree with what he wrote in it, but because he felt like his dissertation would be rejected for political reasons if he included it. The point about Prometheus and so on, in which there's an explicit avowal of the of self-consciousness as the highest, as the only divinity that should be recognized and so on, which is a trope that's explicitly taken from Bauer. And there's correspondence between them at the time and so on. This is a somewhat controversial point of interpretation that's not perhaps as well grounded in the textual evidence as maybe other points I made in the course of this argument, but it is a point that is backed up, among other things, it's backed up by Mering's interpretation in his biography, which, Mering was a student of Engels, and by Engels himself, who regards Marx's dissertation as an example of his idealist period before his materialist turn, putting it a little bit crudely. I mean, like, as I said, I think there's a sense in which Marx is already a materialist, but not in the sense of being an atomist or something like in the sense of Epicurus and so on. And in the course of the dissertation, the whole point is to establish a contrast between the latter-day Epicureanism and the earlier atomism of Democritus. And what for Marx is interesting about the difference is, for one thing, and he's again taking up the explicitly Hegelian interpretation of this legacy. As he himself puts it, Hegel was basically right in outline, even if he didn't. He kind of fudged the details of this philosophy, and he was, in a sense, trying to deepen the account that Hegel kind of just sketched and didn't really develop it in fullness, for reasons that I think have to do with the kind of left Hegelian, Bauerian attempt to diagnose the limitations of Hegelianism in that moment. So there was a sense in which the inadequacy of the account of the philosophies of self-consciousness, including Epicureanism in Hegel's philosophy, kind of pointed to how Hegel was able to take something for granted about the development of Christianity and so on that couldn't be taken for granted anymore. And that leads to Bauer's revision of Hegel in terms of self-consciousness as the absolute and so on. But Marx's account of Epicurus is that he represents a kind of step forward beyond the atomism of Democritus, precisely by not treating atomism as a kind of empirical hypothesis to be validated through sort of physiological, in the ancient sense, research, but as a conceptual form to be understood within a conceptual system. And so, for example, Democritus from Marx has essentially a kind of deterministic conception of nature, the atoms falling in the void, as the determining, everything is determined by the course of the atoms falling in the void. Whereas for Epicurus, and when Epicurus introduces the Kleineman, the random swerve of the atoms, Marx regards this on the one hand as a kind of crude physical speculation, and this is kind of Hegel's take on it as well. But the reason he's driven to make this speculation is what's important for Marx, which is that he's trying to account for something that cannot be accounted for in the terms of Democritus, which is the freedom of the human subject reflecting on this process. So, and that's kind of what's significant. That's what makes it a philosophy of self-consciousness. It's an attempt to clarify this ancient conception, which is maybe deeper in certain respects. And I think Mering himself is basically like, Marx was wrong to kind of denigrate Democritus's naturalistic empirical perspective, and he would later correct himself on that. I don't know if that's really true or not. I've never seen it. I haven't seen anything evincing that sort of perspective from Marx, but perhaps it would be true. I mean, Marx obviously later regard empirical research much more highly than theoretical speculation. But anyway, I think I don't feel like I'm rambling a bit, but that's my sense of it.
No, Marx is very clear about Democritus being an idealist, basically, because the atoms are following a certain ideal logic, mathematical ideal, let's say, geometrical ideal by following the perfect line, whereas the swerve is seen as something disclosing a certain leaning toward proper materialism. This is my paraphrase, but this is how I read, and I think that there are some very explicit points in the text that I cannot remember at this point that do sound like this in the thesis. So yeah,
I think this is an important point of potential argument that would really require a more sustained treatment of that.
It will require time. That there is these writings by Althusser on the same topic, making a similar argument to the one I mentioned just now. Okay, I'll leave the floor for the others to comment.
I mean, I'll just say briefly, I do intend to deal more deeply with that text in the kind of fuller version of this research, but obviously I had to abbreviate. So.
All right. Is there anyone else with any questions? No, I don't see any further questions or comments. So if everything's good, I guess we can wrap up. If there's no one with anything else to add.
I thought this would be more controversial.
Well,
it is, but the enemies are not present.
Sure.
Zach, do you have anything to comment on? You should be able to or willing to, as a Hegelian, fellow Hegelian.
I'm not Hegelian. I'm a Marxist.
I know.
As someone once put it, Marx is more Hegelian than Hegel.
No, he isn't either. I just like to tease you.
well, yeah, it sounds like something Zizek would say, but that's no. I mean, I don't know of any sort of particularly concrete question. Maybe just a very naive question about something you mentioned near the end about this sort of after this dialectics is properly re-inverted and now we sort of sense our freedom in some kind of new social order. Is there a new continuously re-dialecticizing of said relationship moving on, or is this also sort of the realization of the end of an antiquated method, even if that's what allows you to reach this point?
That is an excellent, very interesting question. I would say that this is one of the most difficult questions raised by my research, in the sense that it's kind of difficult to get a sense of how Marx and Engels would themselves answer the question. I think they themselves give conflicting indications of how they might answer that question. So for example, Engels makes comments along the lines of dialectics itself would be subject to continuous revision, but also comments along the lines of even in an emancipated society, new contradictions would emerge that would require further dialectical clarification and transcendence. I myself am very influenced in my thinking on these questions and my own understanding of Marx by, among other sources, the Frankfurt School, specifically Adorno. And Adorno is in the back of my mind here, saying that the goal wouldn't just be like the dialectical sublation of the society, but the transcendence of contradiction itself, and hence the transcendence of dialectics itself, which is itself a kind of almost infuriatingly paradoxical formulation, because it implies the dialectical transcendence of dialectics. So it's a mind bender. And I think what this really gets at for me, while I think the question is interesting, it really gets at the futility of trying to speculate about how future forms of society beyond capitalism would constitute themselves, not only practically, but also in their consciousness of themselves. One thing I always think of when these sorts of questions are raised is a comment Engels makes in The Origin of the Family, in a different connection in relation to sexual relations. But I think it's apropos of social relations more generally, namely that in an emancipated society that never knows the forms of contradiction and alienation that characterize not only capitalist society, but the history of civilization more generally. Once a generation of people has grown up never knowing these forms of life, it will be for them to decide how to constitute their social relations and how to understand them. And they will have little regard for what we would think about them. And that'll be the end of it. So maybe they will continue to think in terms of dialectical contradiction, or maybe those terms will become completely antiquated, and maybe from Engels's perspective, he could speculate as to what a future society would deal with. I think Trotsky, for example, speculates at one point that political questions in a future, communist society would deal with things like the biological manipulation of human human existence through genetics and such. So there could be new political questions, even contradictions over those sorts of issues, perhaps. From our standpoint, we can only really think about that in terms of contradiction and dialectical sublation at best. At worst, we fall below that. But will the future society themselves think of it in those terms? Will those terms continue to apply for them? Maybe, but maybe not. And maybe they'll have a completely different way of thinking that we can barely even have a sense of at this point. So I don't think that's a satisfying answer, but I do think the point would be that for Marx and Engels, the real interest of dialectics is not like metaphysical in the sense of understanding the nature of reality itself, but in terms of understanding the next step in the development of human freedom, the next step that must be taken to overcome the present problem impeding that development. So
Yep, there'd have to be another retroactive process, another man to ape.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, if the key to the anatomy of ape is the anatomy of man, then perhaps if human beings aren't even really human yet, we don't really yet know what these earlier proto forms have within them as potential.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, thanks. It was interesting. I think there's a lot there too, but
Certainly.
Is there any other questions? No. All right. Well, thanks so much, Reid, for an excellent talk. I'm sure it'll be very interesting once this research gets more completed.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful getting to do this, and I'd be happy to do further things of this nature in the future if you'd ever have me again. So,
yes, of course. I'm sure we'll all be in communication. So, all right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks everyone for attending and everyone for asking questions, and we'll see everybody soon. So,
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
thank you.